Hi, everyone. We can see the participants are joining, so we're going to wait just a couple of minutes to give people a chance to get connected and begin listening. All right, so right now, greetings from Elizabeth from Minnesota. Thank you for joining us, Elizabeth. We're excited to have you here. I see we have Brian with us. Hi, Brian. Good afternoon. We have another Elizabeth, Isasa, Silvina, Todd, welcome. We have at least one person on the phone. And I know we have Jacqueline supporting us. All right, so maybe in the interest of time and respecting everyone's schedules, maybe we'll get started. So good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever it is you are. We're delighted you were able to join us for this webinar, and many, many thanks to our special guest, Anggely, who's presenting to us today. We really appreciate you taking time out and just your curiosity to expand your awareness and your knowledge, both in terms of how we can connect with one another and learn from one another, but also how we can learn from Anggely and the research and exploration she's been doing. So I'll introduce formally Anggely Enríquez Cabrera. She has her licensate degree in editorial graphic design and a master's degree in marketing for design. She's an alumna of the International Program of New Pedagogies in the 21st Century for Higher Education Teachers. So we're really excited to have her present to us today. She's a researcher, a university professor, and a thesis advisor in the School of Graphic Design at the Universidad de San Carlos de Guatemala. Anggely is an instructional designer and a training developer. She has experience in learning strategies, learning resource development, online and digital trainings such as e-learning, webinars, prototypes, and instructor and virtual-led trainings. So this is an area that I think many of us are branching into and exploring. So we're pretty excited to hear all about the methodology that she wants to present to us today, called Go On. Just a little side note for you, we will mute all the participants while the presenter is delivering her presentation. And then we welcome you to ask any questions that come up as you're listening. We welcome you to type them into the chat box. And we're looking forward to a discussion at the end after the presentation. We hope you'll really bring your questions and even reflections and thoughts and reactions to what Anggely is going to present to us today. So we hope you'll enjoy this webinar. Damos la bienvenida a todos y esperamos que disfrute este seminario virtual. So over to you, Anggely.
Thank you so much, Breeda, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's such an honor for me to participate in this webinar for UPCEA. So today I'm going to be presenting to you the methodology called Go On. It's a technology-friendly pedagogical approach. So I would like to start with this. So if any of us can relate to this, right? So a student asks, can I use my cell phone in class? And we usually reply no with that face, right? So this is the agenda for today. This is what I'll be covering during this webinar. First, we're going to start explaining the users and the context, then the methodology itself, then the actions and an action plan that I'll be sharing with you, and last, the comments and the questions. All right, so I'm sorry, let's start with the users and the context. So first off, this is basically a data we have about the global smartphone users nowadays, right? This is a forecast basically from 2014 to 2020. So we can see definitely the usage of smartphones is going crazy nowadays, right? So of course, in education, what are we doing about these things? So in Guatemala, the smartphone usage for learning purposes, this is a a basic study that was led in Guatemala, in University of San Carlos de Guatemala, right? And 67% of the students said they were okay with the usage of smartphones in class for learning purposes directly. Then the 33% was just like, no, how about no, right? But this was taken from 283 students, and that was their opinion. So why are we doing this? Who are our users, or what's the context towards this? We have millennials for students nowadays, right? And we definitely can relate to this type of things. They're a me generation, right? Everything's about them. They're absolutely crazy about technology. Of course, they know everything about technology nowadays. They usually search for entrepreneurship, and also they're in the era of information. So anything that we're sharing with them, they can find it on the internet easily and you know, more complete. They usually search for constant feedback, and instead of having teachers, they would love to have mentors instead, right? So this is how these are the users we're going through. This methodology was created in Israel back in December 2017, and it's been applied in a lot of countries, right? It started in Guatemala, then Ecuador, Argentina, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Tanzania. So basically, that's the context. Those are the users we're going through to explain, you know, how this methodology works for them. And what is this, basically? What's going on? It's a technology-friendly pedagogical approach. So let's explain the methodology itself. How does it work? First, we need to have three basic pillars for this. The first one is the TIC criterion, then the Bloom's taxonomy, and then we have the VARK model. So the criteria we're using, it's the TIC, Technology of Information and Communication. We need everything that we use to be interactive, accessible, and reliable, right? Every single tool or application we use in class, we need it to be interactive for whom? For the teachers, and as well for the students, right? Then accessible, because nowadays we can find a lot of tools online, but most of them are, you know, you need to pay for them. So that's why we need to search for good tools that are reliable and accessible for both students and teachers, right? So that's the first criteria we're going to cover during the Go On methodology. Then we have the pedagogy. We're going to be using Bloom's taxonomy, and we need to focus on the students, right? They need to remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create with the content we're sharing, you know, according to the specific class we're delivering. Then the approach we're going to give to all of the contents of the assignment. We need to create visual materials, auditory materials, read and write, and kinesthetic, right? Because we're trying to cover all of the learning methods from students. Okay, but really, how does it work? First, we're going to start with the basics for a class. We're going to divide a class into modules, right? Usually it's 3 to 4 modules if it's a semester for university. Then we're going to use in-class technology regarding to tools and applications, and then an online platform. So the basics for this, for example, since this methodology works for both face-to-face classes and also online classes, we need to cover the basics for both, right? So in a face-to-face class or an in-class, the basics are, first, we need to check for the attendance. Then we need to provide the content, then an activity related to the content that we just presented, for example, and then a wrap-up activity to see if the students got the content we were presented, right? So that's the basics for a face-to-face class. Then we have an online class. What do we need for that? For example, if we have a Moodle virtual, you know, academic classroom or Google Scholar, or it will depend on what you use, right? So for online classes, we usually have the materials. Basically the materials are the content and the activities we would give on a face-to-face class, right? Then we have the homework explained on the platform. Then we have a discussion or test usually, and then blogs of opinion that we can add on any of these different platforms for education. So having that clear, right, we have the basics, what we need to cover during a face-to-face class and what we need to cover during an online class. Then having this 3 pillars, right, for Go On, which is the criteria of TIC, the Bloom's taxonomy, and then the VARK model, we're going to start with a different subject. So in this case, we're going to call it subject X, right? It would depend on the class that you're delivering on your school, on your university, or wherever you are, right? So it can be a theoretical subject, it can be a practical, or both, right? So first, we need to define the contents, right, of the class. That's one of the basics of the basic things we need to do. First, define the topics, the subtopics, and the references that we're going to be using to cover this subject, right? If it's theoretical, practical, or both. Then we need to define the objectives of the content of the course, right? The goals and the KPIs we're going to be covering with the students. And then we define the activities regarding to the objectives and also the contents, right? The projects they're going to be doing towards the semester, then the assignments, the homework, etc. So once we have that defined, what we're going to do is we're going to define the academic calendar, right? So in this case, this is an example of the first semester of 2019. And we're going to select the dates that we're going to be having for teaching directly, you know, putting holidays aside and putting vacations aside. So in this case, for example, we have in January, we started on the 21st, and then we're going to complete the semester by May the 12th, right? This is how it was the first semester of 2019, for example, in Universidad de San Carlos de Guatemala, right? So once we have the academic calendar, we're going to start with the modules, right? So we need to define first the contents, the objectives, and the activities according to the syllabus of our course. Then the academic calendar. Once we have that, we can start defining the modules that we're going to be using. So according to the criteria of Go On, which is the TICS criteria, then Bloom's taxonomy, and also the VARK model, what we're going to do is, for example, for subject X, we have 14 to 16 weeks of classes, right? According to our academic calendar. So we're going to divide it in 3 or 4 modules. It would depend on what we need to do or what we need to cover or how many projects we're going to be covering during the semester. So in this case, for example, we have January and February are going to be all together, since in January we only have 2 weeks, then March, April, and May. So each one of these is going to be a module. So the first module is going to be called Introduction, for example. The second one in this case is going to be called Definition. The third one is going to be called Planning. The fourth is going to be called Implementation, right? So we're going to divide the contents according to the Bloom's taxonomy, what we need the students to do with the contents that we're going to be delivering during each module. So for example, in the module called Introduction, we need the students to understand, to remember and understand basic theoretical stuff, for example. So it depends on the kind of subject you're going to be delivering, but even if it's a practical subject, we first need to give a couple of instruction and a couple of theories for them to develop during the whole semester, right? So we're going to start with this module called Introduction, and then our objectives and KPIs are going to be according to the Bloom's taxonomy. In this case, remember and understand. Then on the second one that we have Definition. In this case, in this example, for example, Definition and Planning are all together. So we're going to be using all of our objectives are going to be leading to apply and analyze the content that they understood on the first module. So in this case, we're going to have them together, right? And then in the final module, which is the fourth one, we will need the students to evaluate and create. So our objectives are going to be leading to that, or our competencies are going to be leading to that as well. So once we have that defined according to the contents that we're going to be using, we're going to be searching for different methodologies that are used nowadays that will actually meet the objectives that we define. So for example, in the first module, if it's an introductory module and we need the students to remember and understand a lot of theories, we're going to use flipped classroom, right? So this flipped classroom basically it defies the traditional model of learning, right? Instead of us giving a lecture and then pushing all of the content to our students, and then while they're at their houses doing their homework, they will have a lot of questions, right? So we do the exact opposite. They have the lectures on their houses. That's why we're going to be using, for example, an online platform for education, because we're going to be sharing the content with them there. And then when they get to class on a face-to-face methodology, they're going to be doing the homework there, right? There's where all of the questions actually pop up. So we're going to be using flipped classroom to this one, for example. Then on the second and third module, we're going to be using gamification. It actually works with apply and analyze, and the objectives that we're going to be defining for these modules called definition and planning. And then for the last one, we're going to be using project-based learning, because we need to evaluate, the students need to evaluate what they create with the content they just learned for the whole semester, right? So once we define these different methodologies according to the contents and according to the objectives we define according to the Bloom's taxonomy, we're going to define the resources and how we're going to be doing them, right? So for example, for the first module called Introduction, the resources that we're going to look for are resources and tools according to flipped classroom directly, right? So we're going to see a couple of examples later on. Also, with gamification, which is the second and the third module, we're going to be looking for applications and tools according to this method directly, and also the objectives that we define and the contents that we're going to be covering, right? So for this last step, where we have the resources, we're going to be using the VARK model itself, right? Because we need to define resources that are visual, auditory, kinesthetic, etc. So this is basically how a module will look like. You know, this is the overall of the subject, but this is how every module will look like. So for example, the first module called Introduction, that's going to be using flipped classroom. We have the taxonomy, the objectives are leading to remember and understand for our students. Then the tools and applications that we can use, for example, if we're using flipped classroom on any module, if it's an online class, we're going to be giving all of the tools and resources mostly to online resources, right? Because they're going to be having their contents in their houses, and then while they get to school, they will be able to do their homework there, right? Or all of the activities there, applying the content they just learned. So for online, what we can do, for an LMS, we can use Moodle or Edmodo, right? We can nowadays use also Google Scholar. All of these tools that I'm going to be presenting to you basically meet the criteria of TIC, right? They're interactive, they're accessible, and they're reliable. So we have Google Classroom, then we can use TED Talks. It's something that's very catchy nowadays for students, right? If they need to search for something, they go for TED Talks nowadays, which is an amazing tool that we can use. Also, the MOOCs, right? The massive open online courses. We can find a lot of amazing content from a lot of universities around the globe, which are from Coursera, edX, Khan Academy, etc. So we can find amazing content there, and very reliable, mostly. We can use Play Post It. Play Post It is an application that lets you do interactive videos. So for example, if you have a content that you found in any of these MOOCs, or for example, you found a TED Talk in YouTube, what you can do is you upload the URL in Play Post It, right? And then it lets you put different questions during the video, right? So it would make the video interactive. So that's great, and it's for free. Then we can use also audiobooks, right? It's something amazing nowadays as well. So these are all of the possible applications and tools that we can use for a flipped classroom. All of these are for free, and they meet the TIC criteria. Then in class, what we can do is using Answer Garden or Kahoot. Answer Garden basically is kind of like a poll activity where we ask questions to our students, and then by them using their cell phones, they can put their answers, and they will be displayed on a computer, for example, right? So they will need to raise their hand and answer if they're too shy to do it, for example. So Play Post It, Answer Garden, does that for us. Then we can use Kahoot as well, which is a little more playful, but it's an amazing tool that we can use also for making trivias during a class, right? Then for the second and third modules that are going to be using the gamification, methodology, according to our taxonomy, we define that these modules, that were definition and planning, are going to be, the objectives are going to be leading to analyze and apply the content they just learned from a flipped classroom during the first module, right? So the tools and applications that they can use, for example, for an in-class subject, first, we can team them up, right? Using avatars and defining, for example, a logo for each team, right? What we can use as well as are QR codes and augmented reality. There are a lot of tools nowadays that are for free and are very reliable and accessible to create QR codes and then share content with our students immediately, right? They don't need to wait for us to upload it to Moodle or upload it to Edmodo or or Google Classroom for us to do it, right? We can share right on the class with a QR code, and they can have the content right after. Then we can use answer garden as well in here for gamification, right? The idea is for them to be having a playful context during the class. Then Kahoot, and also we can use polls and trivia. There are tons of applications nowadays and tools we can find online for free that will give us these activities, right? Polls and trivia during the class. And then last but not least, which is very important if we're using a gamification methodology, is the usage of badges, right? We need to basically let them know when they're doing things right, right? This is the idea of gamification. We're basically copying the model that's used in video games, right? And once you achieve something, you get a badge for doing so, etc. So we will need to define what kind of badges we're going to be sharing with our students, depending on what they're achieving, right? So for online platforms, what we're going to be using is definitely our LMS, Moodle, Edmodo, etc. Then the badges and the board, of course, that needs to be displayed, not only giving them to an in-class environment, but also online. We need to define who's on the first place, for example, right? If we team them up, and if they're using avatars or logos for every team, we need to put that board with every different logo indicating which one is winning, for example, right? Then the polls that we can use on online platforms, nowadays Moodle, for example, Edmodo lets us do that. And then the blogs of opinion, right? Then for the last module in this case, which is project-based learning, according to this, the fourth module is implementation, right? We're going to be creating all of our objectives according to the evaluation and the creation of their projects according to what they learned during the semester. So once we define the objectives, what we can use for tools and applications, if it's an in-class environment, we can use the camera and voice recording of the students' cell phones, right? We need to remember that every single student nowadays has a smartphone. So we can use all of the tools that they have on their cell phone. So if we need them to create a project during the class itself, they can use the camera and the voice recorder, for example. They can, for example, do an audiovisual right there. Then the information, the access information directly with the internet, right? We can make the students do a quick research during class because they have internet access with the smartphone, for example. Then the usage of social network, for example, if we need them to do live presentations, I mean, why not? They can share what they're doing during class or presenting their projects, right? Then the usage of QR codes as well. They can create their own QR codes and then share their projects in different platforms. Then augmented reality as well, right? Then, of course, the usage of Google Drive, which is completely for free. They can upload their projects right in the class environment. Then for online tools and applications, what we can use is, of course, the LMS. It would depend on the one that you use. But in this case, for example, we have Moodle or Edmodo. Then they can use Adobe Suite, right? This one is paid, but I put this as an example because I work with graphic designers. So of course they can use the Adobe Suite. But then I provide you another examples that are for free completely. So Padlet, for example, lets students do boards in a very friendly environment. This one is for free. It's basically doing different or interactive boards that they can do in class. Then we have Canva as well. Canva is another tool that they can use to create handouts with basic knowledge of graphic design, for example, but they can do amazing handouts or anything they need, you know, to present their project. Then we have Powtoon as well, that it's for free, where they can do interactive presentations directly. Then, of course, the blog of opinion. So these are a couple of tools and applications that they can use according to, first, the content we're going to be covering during each model and the objectives we're going to be covering. So for this example, we have this order of the taxonomy, the Bloom's taxonomy, but it would depend, of course, on how you divide the contents for the class. So different education trends that we can use for every module or for different modules, for example. Here we have, in the example, I presented you flipped classroom, gamification, and PBL, which is project-based learning. But these are very popular nowadays. But the ones that are, for example, education trends for 2019 are this ones. For example, we have mindfulness, which is regarding to not only teaching the content of a subject itself, but also teaching well-being for students, right? Their wellness of self. Then we have visual thinking, which also leads to the usage of a lot of images to explain something instead of just giving theoretical content. And then we have augmented reality and virtual reality. There are tons of tools and applications nowadays that can help us to use this. Then we have adaptive learning, that basically it will let us to adapt the content according to the different styles of learning for our students, right? Then we have micro learning. Basically, this micro learning uses a lot of MOOCs, for example, because we can share them a whole content in a video that would only last 5 minutes, for example, right, on a TED Talks, or it would depend on the quantity of content we need to share to them, right? So these are education trends for 2019. These are, of course, changing every year, but these are the ones that we can use according to the content that we're going to be using for our module and according to the objectives we define, you know, through the Bloom's taxonomy. So this way we can say that we can let our students to use their cell phone for free, right? Completely on a class environment, on a learning environment. All right, so according to our agenda, right now I'm going to be presenting to you the actions and an action plan and how we can implement the Go-On methodology on every single subject. So this is basically the action plan I'm going to be sharing with you. So I'm going to be giving a brief explanation of this, and then I'm going to be sharing a QR code so that you can download it on your cell phone. So first, this is basically a flow chart, and it will explain how we can you know, implement the Go-On methodology. Starting from the design phase, for example, we need to select a course where we're going to be applying the Go-On methodology. Then dividing the course itself into modules, right? Then the learning outcomes, right? We need to define the learning outcomes according to the criteria, the TICS criteria, right? Interactive tools, accessible tools, and then reliable tools, of course. Then we have the pedagogy, the Bloom's taxonomy, right? We're going to be defining the objectives according to the Bloom's taxonomy, or the competencies we need to develop into our students. Then the approach according to the VARK model, and then the resources, we have them here. What we need to complete the design phase, for example, for this action plan, we need first a device, right? A laptop, a smartphone, an iPad, etc., where we're going to be, you know, testing all of the tools that we're going to be using, testing all of the applications that we're going to be using. And then a course syllabus. Of course, we need the course syllabus to divide the content that we're going to be covering during a semester or a specific time. And then the academic calendar, right? Which is the first exercise that we did in here, right? I showed you what was the academic calendar for the first semester, for example, for my university. Then on the planning phase, what we're going to be doing is first dividing the topics per module, right? Then the topics according to the pedagogy, right? Definitely defining the objectives, and then the topics according to every single module and what we're going to be covering and then achieving with our students, you know, in every module. Then we have the topic approach, right? We're going to be defining what types of materials we're going to be developing for our students, right? According to the VARK model, which is visual materials, auditory materials, read and write materials, and kinesthetic materials, right? Then the apps selection according to the criteria, right? Accessible, interactive, and reliable. Then testing the applications, right? So the resources we're going to be needing for this specific process, for the planning process, are the course syllabus as well, right? The open source application, we need them to be accessible for students and reliable, of course, because nowadays we can find a lot of accessible tools and applications that they're for free, but usually, we need to test them and see if they're reliable, right? Then, of course, we're going to be needing for resources for this process directly, the devices to be testing out of these applications and tools. Then for the next process on our flow chart, we have implementation. So it's divided in class and online. So in this case, right, if you have a face-to-face class, or if it's an online class directly, we will select, the different process that's listed in here. Or if it's a mixed class, we can use both, right? So for in class, we need to define, we need to check up for the attendance, the content, the activities, and the wrap-ups using the applications and the tools that will meet the criteria that we define for TIC, and also the objectives that we need to meet according to the content we're going to be delivering, right, in a specific time. Then for online, what we need to do, or what we need to keep in mind, are the materials or the content that we're going to be sharing with our students. In this case, is the content and the activities that we would give on a face-to-face class. Then the homeworks, we're going to be putting them, in an online platform. Then the discussions and tests and the blogs. That's all we need to take good care of. And then after having that defined, we can, select the tools and applications that would meet the criteria that we define. The resources that we're going to be needing for the implementation process on this flowchart are basically the equipment and devices that we need to test everything out, right? Internet access, definitely. Applications and stationery in the case of face-to-face classes, right? So the resources we're going to be needing for implementation process on an online class are the devices, the online platform, definitely, and then the websites to create free accounts directly. Then last but not least, we have the evaluation phase, right? We need to evaluate if this methodology works per module and per semester, right? So per module, we need to evaluate two things, the student's evaluation and also the teacher evaluation. So the student's evaluation for in-class, for example, we need to evaluate every single module if their students are engaging with this type of methodology, right? Because sometimes the usage of a lot of tools might be definitely not engaging for students. So we need for them to engage with a single tool, with a couple of tools, we can say, and also us, right? Being able to use and actually like the tool we're sharing with our students, right? So we need to check up for the engagement per module. Then the activities, how does it work? Sometimes we actually spend a lot of time explaining the students how to use a tool instead of spending that time during the activity itself, using the tool. So that's something good to keep in mind. It's something that I discovered during the evaluation phase for my students, right? For during a particular module. I'll explain that later on, but that's how it was, right? We need to keep in mind that these tools need to be friendly for our students and for ourselves as well, because we can spend a lot of time as well as teachers trying to figure out how this tool works, right? Or how this application works. So that's why we need to be evaluating this during the module. Then the feedback, of course, and homeworks. We need to evaluate that per module. Then for online, how we can evaluate this type of things during a module, for example, the usage of forums or blocks of opinion. So what we need to do this, for example, our resources are for in-class, the devices, and stationery, right? We can do regular tests with sheets and pens, or we can use different, for example, we can use Google Forms. So we would need our students to use their device and answer the questions to see, to evaluate their engagement, the activities, and the feedback we're going to be receiving from them. Then for online, what we can use is the online platform, right? And online free resources as well. Then per semester, what we need to define, after we have completed all of the modules using the Go-On methodology, we need to define how the semester was. So of course, for the course, we need to evaluate the students' evaluation to see if they learned using all of these different tools, using all of these different materials created by the VARK model, right? The students' evaluation, and then the key partners. So in this case, we can evaluate the different results with different classes that implemented this, right? Because the good thing about the Go On methodology is that it can be applied by any subject in any university, right? So we need to also keep in mind or keep an eye in what are the best practices used in different subjects, right? Then per semester, we need to evaluate as well the teacher evaluation, which is basically a self-evaluation, right? We need to do a self-reflection to see how this was, to evaluate the burnout level, for example, and then creating a SWOT model, for example, to see what was done right, what was done wrong, what we can do better, right? Because, for example, the first time you apply this methodology, it might be a little overwhelming because you're going to be playing and testing a lot of different tools and applications for class, right? So it can be, doing a self-reflection by the end of the semester would be great to see what was done right and what we can do better for the next semester if we are going to be implementing this methodology for the class again, right? So this is basically the action plan I wanted to share with you. It's a step-by-step plan that we can use to implement this methodology, keeping in mind, all of these resources that are listed in here. So now you can have it. I ask you the question, want to go on? So please, if you have a QR code scanner on your cell phone, you can scan this and have in your cell phone the action plan I just presented. I'll give you a couple of minutes, and then I'll continue with the presentation.
And I see while people are working on that, we do have some questions coming up in the chat box. So just a reminder to folks that we can address those at the end of the presentation. So feel free to enter any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, reactions into the chat box.
Thanks, Breeda.
No problem.
All right, so following up with the presentation. So for the agenda, we have the last point, in this case, the comments and questions. So please, as Breeda said, right, feel free to type them in the chat box. And we're gonna be sharing, a couple of experiences of how this worked for me. And also we have this, it says, in my past lives, we didn't have cell phones and we got along just fine, right? So this is mostly the idea that we have sometimes of, avoiding the usage of technology for learning purposes. So let's change that. It's not an easy goal to meet, but actually, if our students are changing, of course, education needs to change somehow, right? So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to share this with you. And again, feel free to do your questions and ask anything.
Thank you so much, Anggely. Muchas gracias. So perhaps we could go now to some of the questions. Before we go to those, I just wanted to maybe say my own reaction. I felt that this was an incredibly well-structured description of how we can apply a methodology to developing online webinars, online instruction, online training. you included so many tools and strategies and a structure as well. Oftentimes we don't get both in the same moment. You know, you can get ideas and strategies or tools and tricks, but you don't always get the comprehensive structure that you provided about how to plan the whole thing, beginning with the scaffolding, the structure, the framework, and then integrating the different strategies and tools throughout. I thought you also provided us with some great examples of where and when to use different tools and strategies. Some are best suited to the earlier components of a training or a course, and others can best be used in the middle or towards the end. And I really enjoyed that you were able to put so much in there without it being overwhelming, that you structured it and actually made suggestions about when to use specific strategies. I really liked that you gave us also all of the current terminology, all of the different buzzwords, and that you were also able to keep it at the level that's digestible. The visuals that you used also, I think, are going to be helpful for people as they move forward. So again, muchísimas gracias for all of that. As we look at the chat box, we have a couple of comments and perhaps maybe some questions. So Silvina is saying, thank you very much, Anggely. How important to know so many tools and applications to boost interest through gamification. So I'm not sure, Silvina, if you're asking how important is it to know all of those, or you're reinforcing that it is so important to know how we can boost their interest through gamification. Anggely, I'll let you maybe respond to that a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Silvina. Thank you so much, Breeda. So I think this is a very, sometimes it's very difficult to kind of like get used to understand the importance of the usage of technology and these different tools for learning purposes, right? Because we usually use them for our idle time, right? Of course, we have a lot of tools and a lot of applications on our cell phones, and usually when we're bored or something, we just grab our cell phones and then play around with it. But why cannot we use that for education directly if our students are using that every single day, right? Of course, they spend a lot of time in their cell phones, so why not using that tool directly for learning purposes? So I think it's very important. It's a big challenge for us to move from the traditional education models, to implement these type of things. But it's not impossible, since for students it's very, very easy to adapt into those type of things, right? So I think it's very, very important to have that in mind, that we spend a lot of time using our cell phones, then why not using that as a tool for education instead of a distractor, right?
That's a great point. You're right. Meet the students where they're at and use the activities that they already have familiarity with or high interest in. Valeria had also a comment. She said, thank you, Angie. The instructional design that you're presenting is very clear and useful. I like the fact that you include different types of educational technology for different types of students' interests. That's such a great point. Again, related to what you were saying, meeting the students, no matter what their path in life or stage in life is, meeting them with the types of technology that they're familiar with, that they're comfortable with, and really acknowledging, I suppose, that they're learning even in their leisure time. We are learning to use certain activities during our leisure time. Why not use those? And I think that's what Valeria is appreciating there, that you included such a great range of educational technology for different types of students.
Thank you. I think it's also very important to use different tools, according to the different models of learning of our students, right? Because we usually share resources that are only visual or audiovisual, right? But how about kinesthetic learners, right? So in this case, the usage of technology, the usage of a cell phone can make them, basically use their hands and move to learn, right? So this is why we use also the VARK model to implement the different tools and application, right, according to their different learning models.
And I think that reminds me of an often used error in learning technology and in learning theory. Sometimes people think that a learner has just one preferred style of learning or one style of learning. I'm an auditory learner, I'm a visual learner, I'm a kinesthetic learner. And the reality is, and the research has shown, that in fact we all use multiple modalities. We may have a preferred or a style or one that we have used more often. But in reality, the richest learning environments are those that incorporate all of the different styles and modalities of learning. For adult learners, I think that's a helpful piece to make them aware of, as well as tackling. Would you have any examples that you could share with us, Anggely, of how you've used these ideas and used Go On, you know, as a methodology in designing instruction, designing trainings yourself in Guatemala?
Perfect. Right. So I usually use the Go On methodology with my senior students at Universidad San Carlos de Guatemala. So they're basically developing their graduation project on graphic design, right? So basically using, you know, a PBL methodology, you know, with the different applications to meet that criteria is amazing for that, for students that are developing a project itself, right? So they have a whole year. I just one semester, but I have my students for an entire year, right? So I need to basically define all of the KPIs they need to meet according to the usage of the different tools and how they manage to use them, right? So I think one of the greatest things I've learned through the usage of Go On is, first, I need to understand what tools and applications I'm going to be sharing, right? Because sometimes we say like, wow, this is a new tool, this is a very trendy tool and application, and then I'm going to be sharing that with my students. But of course, they can use it a lot more easily than I can. So of course, I need to first practice with that, and then see if that meets the learning purposes I need that to meet, right? Because sometimes the students will even come to me and say, you know what, I just found this tool and I just found this application and I find it very helpful. But of course, we need to meet that criteria of that tool, of that specific tool, to the contents that they're going to be, you know, delivering during a specific module, right? And also, how are we going to evaluate the contents and how that needs to meet the objectives we define for that. So it's not only about the usage of different tools and applications that look trendy and that are nice and that our students can use, but of course we need to test them out and see if they meet the learning purposes that we're defining.
That's a great point. It may not just be exciting, but it also needs to be fluid, smooth, and easy for the students to still focus on the content, as opposed to focusing on any frustration or issues they're having with the application or the tool. Content, ultimately, mastering the content is the focus. That's a great point. Brian Cook entered a question that I also had, and I was wondering at the same time. Our university uses QM, or Quality Matters, as a rubric. It's a faculty-driven peer review process for developing content, particularly for online courses. So the question is, does Go On utilize a similar quality assurance system?
Go On actually gives, for example, the usage of taxonomy, the Bloom's taxonomy. But for example, I just mentioned also the competencies model, right? So it would depend on how you can deliver your content. So this is the greatest thing about Go On, right? That you can actually make it yours, right? You define the rubrics and you define the KPIs that are going to be need to be met. In this case, you know, the usage of the Bloom's taxonomy, for example, it was very easy to digest and to understand because it's very, very basic. But it will depend on what you need to cover, you know, what the style of defining the objectives is according to the different universities, right? So for this case, what I use usually is the Bloom's taxonomy and also the competencies model, right? So sometimes I use Bloom's taxonomy and sometimes I use the competencies model. So it would depend on what you need to cover during that. So this is the greatest thing about Go On methodology, that you can make it yours according to your content and according to your requirements in university.
And I understand that in relation to the content, creating and modifying rubrics so that we can measure whether or not we've covered all the content, whether or not the students have mastered it, and where we stand in terms of moving them from one learning level to another. One of the things that Quality Matters has is a rubric for the course design itself. So the question might be whether Go On helps an instructor or an instructional designer look at the courses that's being developed and see, okay, what design rubric am I measuring my work against? Not just about the course content and what we're teaching the students, but actually whether or not the course is well designed. Does it include all 4 sections? Does it have, you know, distinctive components to it? Are there specific standards that an instructional designer needs to meet, or does Go On provide models and say, this is what a good class structure looks like, this is what a beginning, you know, first effort might look like, here's what an excellent example of a well-developed course would look like, not necessarily related to the content that you're studying. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you. So for example, for the action plan that was presented, this is a basic module, you know, that uses design, implementation. Let me go back to it. So it basically uses design, planning, implementation, and evaluation to create the whole course itself, right? To develop a course, you know, with the content that you're going to be using, etc. But this basically simplifies an ADDIE model. This is what it does, right? Because the ADDIE model sometimes is used only by instructional designers, and we know how it works, for example, or the SEM model itself. So basically this one, it's a simplified version of it. So we can find that in the action plan that was shared with you, you know, having all of these different phases, but very resumed, right? Not having, for example, if a teacher needs to develop this and it's not an instructional designer, they can know how to design something, then how to plan it, and then execute it, and then evaluate that part, you know, without knowing the whole ADDIE model itself, which is a lot more, you know, long in terms of a process, you know, how you develop it.
I like that visual. I really enjoy the visual aspect of Go On. I think it's better developed than a lot of examples I've seen, or a lot of structural systems I've seen. Brian, does that answer your question about quality assurance and the peer review process? I'm watching the chat box. Yes, thanks, he says. We have greetings desde Rivera, Uruguay. Saludos a todos. And at the moment, I'm not seeing any other new questions in the chat box. So I'll encourage everybody to enter a question if you have one. Thanks, Anggely, for sharing your experiences. Is there anything that you wish you had known before you started using Go On, or any sort of pros and cons that you would share with us now that you've become more experienced with it?
Thank you. It's such a great question. So the first time I implemented the Go On methodology, I was all happy about it. I was like so pumped up. I was like, this is going to work a lot for my students. They're going to love it. And
such an optimist, yes.
I know. And then when I started implementing that, I noticed that my class didn't have Wi-Fi access. So,
okay.
I know, it was something very funny, right? Because of course, most of the tools that we use usually need the use of internet directly, right? All of them are online. Most of them are online. So of course, that was a great learning experience for myself. And then for the next class, for the upcoming class back then, I told my students, all right, you need to download that first in your houses, and then we're going to start using it in class, right? So those type of things we need to keep in mind, you know, for the basic and most simple things, such as internet access, right? But then the next year, I noticed that we didn't have Wi-Fi as well in my class. The internet just got interrupted, and then my students didn't hesitate to use their cellular, their mobile data. So it was great. I thought they were going to say like, no, we don't have internet access, we don't have Wi-Fi, so we're not going to do this, right? But nope, they didn't hesitate to use that. And it was amazing. Even the ones that didn't have internet access on their cell phones, they will team up. So that was something amazing, and it will only represent how engaged the students were. So that was a great learning experience for myself. I saw, you know, sometimes we think that the applications only need to use internet, but sometimes we don't have internet access in class, right? So of course we need to see and innovate what we can use by using just the cell phone, right? Of course they have the camera, of course they have the voice recorder, so they can, you know, use those tools that the cell phone itself has for them to develop a project for an activity or for an exercise that we're developing during a class.
That also speaks to the problem-solving process and engaging students in problem-solving. You know, we may not often think of the best solution ourselves and may presume that there is no solution, and your example really shows us that oftentimes students have better solutions to obstacles than we might come up with ourselves. What a great story. I like that example.
Thank you, Breeda.
All right, so I see we're coming up to the end of the time, and I know folks probably have meetings they're rushing off to. We have just points of thanks there in the chat box, and one more question from Brian. What are the top 2 to 3 reasons to teach and learn online in Guatemala? Okay,
cool. That's a great question. So for my specific experience, for example, my students are graphic designers. So definitely, they're very aware of the usage of the online tools nowadays. Of course, they need to be, you know, they need to know a lot of technology things, and online, they need to be up to that all the time. Yeah. So for example, in this case, for graphic designers, this is a very young career, we can call it that way. So of course, all the students are mostly millennials, you know, or centennials, we can call them that as well. So of course, we need to adapt to that, to those type of learnings. So in this case, you would think like in Guatemala, definitely these type of careers are, you know, growing up so fast. For example, 20 years from now, graphic design was not seen as a great career here in Guatemala, but nowadays it is. And a lot of students are, you know, following that career. So that works extremely well for that. And not only for graphic design, right? That's like my personal example for that. But also most of our students in university, if they, you know, enter school at 18 years old, of course, they're they were born in the digital era, so we need to adapt to that. They usually don't put attention most if they don't care about the topic, but if you engage them with something they used on a day-to-day basis, of course it's going to be something great. So that's what we can see in Guatemala directly, that most of the students nowadays are very, very young, and of course they were born in the digital era.
So it's not just about being up with online learning and learning applications and tools. It's actually making sure that learning takes place in ways that they're familiar with, meeting them, how they communicate, how they socialize, how they live. And that's why we need to adapt to their way of living, as opposed to pretending that online learning is something new. We need to move the learning field into where they're at.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for that question, Brian. All right, well, we are just at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Anggely. Muchas gracias for this very interesting presentation and very visually stimulating content. I think it's been a very useful presentation that we'll be able to apply and share with our own colleagues. So we look forward to hearing more from you as you continue in your journey of helping us get into the 21st century with our teaching methodologies. And thanks so much for taking the time to present as part of UPCEA. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Breeda, and thank you so much, everyone, for being able to join in this webinar.
Thanks again. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.